War World History. This is the last section of the War and Revolution unit. And the thing we're just going to start with is the map of Europe and how it changed, because the focus question is about the changes that World War II had on the world. The question specifically is, what is the legacy of the First World War? So, just going back to the picture, one of the major legacies is the maps of Europe changed. You could call this a political change, you could call it a geographic change, but that's, you're looking for an answer to the focus question, take a look at the very first slide. German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Turkish Ottoman Empire all gone at the end of World War II. World War I, rather. Okay. So the First World War ends at the Second Battle of the Marne, more or less. It's not officially the end of the war, but it's part of the kind of major pivot point of 1917, which is the year in which Russia effectively loses the war to Germany when the Soviet Union, after the revolution, signs a peace treaty with the Germans, giving Germany most of what is now modern-day Ukraine and Belarus and Poland, the various Baltic states. So again, 1917, total German victory on the Eastern Front. However, same year, the United States joins the war and starts to ship troops to Europe. And by 1918, there's enough troops to actually make a huge difference on the outcome. The very first battle in which American troops are instrumental is this, again, Second Battle of the Marne, which is where General Erich von Ludendorff, who is one of the two major generals with General von Hindenburg, who effectively become the dictators of Germany in the last years of the war. Let's see. So basically, with all the German troops free from beating the Russians, they now are available to go travel to the Western Front under Ludendorff's offensive, which is meant to knock the French out of the war, just like back in the old days with the Schlieffen Plan, intended to, when the Russians got beaten, to go fight the French. So there are not just Americans at the Second Battle of the Marne, there are also many French folks, obviously. It's a battle in France. Marne is clearly a French name. And there are also Moroccan soldiers who basically were on the front lines because they were French colonial subjects who took much of the most brutal fighting and ended up defending the lines long enough for the American reinforcements to arrive. So about 150,000 Americans in this battle, where the Germans stop advancing into France and then continue to retreat for the rest of the war. And then basically because of the number of Americans involved in the war, Ludendorff gives up effectively by September. So this battle's in March into April. This battle's in April. And by the time it's September, the million American troops on the European continent make Ludendorff think, there's no way we can win this. We haven't even been able to win a victory since the Second Battle of the Marne. It's time to surrender. And the way we're going to surrender is based on Wilson's 14 points. So in 1918, there's a German revolution. It ends up in a socialist victory. So the Social Democratic Party of Germany, in this picture right here, you can see them making the proclamation of the German Republic, are able to take over the country. So basically, the Kaiser's dealing with the fact that his country is losing a war, and when you lose a war, your people don't really trust the government anymore. So his hope was that he could basically avoid losing the German monarchy by making some compromises. So instead of actually making a compromise, he promises elections that are going to be more fair. There's this whole election system in Germany that gives rich people more votes. And he says, well, we're going to get rid of that. And he appoints a noble to be the prime minister of Germany. And so that doesn't really satisfy anyone. And in November, sailors, just like in Russia during the Russian Revolution, uprise. They're basically told they're going to go back out and have to die in the ocean because the British and American navies outnumber the German Navy, so the sailors don't want to do it. They form councils, which in Russian are called Soviets, and this happens throughout all of northern Germany. So this is simultaneous to the communist revolution happening in Russia. There is what looks like the early stages of the Russian Revolution before the communist coup happening in Germany. So the Kaiser flees after the sailors have their revolt in Kiel, and these kind of Soviets pop up in Germany. And the leader of the SDP, which is the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is the largest party in the German parliament, probably has majority support of the German population, in spite of the kind of wonky voting system, declares the monarchy abolished, and that's what you're looking at over here. So they basically, the Social Democrats see a power vacuum. They say, well, guess what? We're in charge now. And they create an armistice with the Allied powers, a new constitution that's frankly the most democratic in the entire world. It's got things like a right to education, a right to, total women equality, things that, racial equality, things that the U.S. Constitution doesn't really activate until the 60s. So it's a really, really progressive constitution. So in short, the German Revolution results in a socialist victory because they were able to seize the moment effectively. So there's also an element where, so they seize the moment where the revolution occurs. They've won the revolution. Congratulations, socialists. And then there's a counter-revolution, which involves, in this case, communists who think, hey, the Russians are doing it right. You socialists, social democrats, you're going to have democratic elections. We need to have the Communist Party in charge. And we need to make sure that, we don't just recreate capitalism under a new system and that kind of thing. And this is mostly under the two prominent German socialists, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They call it the Spartacist Uprising. Basically, they try to have a strike to convince the government to do, among other things, break up large landed estates in the east of Germany in which the peasants effectively still live in the Middle Ages. The socialist government says, we're not going to start getting rid of property rights. The communists don't like it. And this is the beginning of the split, really the split between socialist and communist. So if you, have somebody tell you these are the same thing, make a reference to Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, they'll have no idea what you're talking about, but you'll be right, which won't help you at all. But in any case, the basic deal that the socialists made, so you got a communist uprising, is to team up with the group of folks who end up becoming fascists later on. So is a group called the Freikorps, the Free Soldiers, and they are kind of what they sound like. They're effectively elements of the German military that we're told that Germany had surrendered in World War I. Most of them were in the East, where Germany had won World War I. There's a socialist government. They were under, prior to that, this monarchy that hated socialism. They see themselves as just being their own thing. They don't accept the authority of the state, per se. But the socialists say, hey, renegade soldiers, go kill some communists for us. And they do. And so they murder Liebknecht and Luxemburg. And basically, the socialists keep their victory after winning it by seizing the moment by teaming up with the proto-fascists and using violence to crush what had initially begun as a peaceful strike against the government. So it's kind of it's a flawed victory. You can kind of see some of the reasons that the Weimar Republic ends up collapsing. You get the socialists hated by communists and the fascists, so they don't have a lot of support. So Wilson is the one whose idea is basically convinced the German people that they should surrender because they're not meant to be a punishment. The idea behind Wilson's 14 points is to have a peace at the end of World War I that won't result in more wars. And so he's mostly advocating for what's called self-determination, which is effectively democracy. The right to determine your own future. You vote. You have the ability to choose what form of government it takes. The League of Nations is basically meant to be democracy on the world scale. Each country gets one vote, and they solve the problems of the world instead of having war. So no more empires, no more taking advantage of other countries. We talk it out and make things happen at the League of Nations. So he says absolutism and militarism are the things that are actually being fought in World War I, which is a beautiful metaphor and frankly accurate. However, although most people supported these ideas, like normal folks, you and me, the leaders in most of the European empires had a motivation to preserve their empires. And so this turned out to be kind of an insurmountable obstacle. Oh, yeah, let's get rid of Germany's colonies. But we can't get rid of the Belgian Congo. Where will the Belgians get their blood diamonds? Three main negotiators at the end of World War I after the German Revolution and surrender. Lloyd George of Britain, La Tigre, do you see his mustache right there, of George Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. So Clemenceau, the tiger, you can see it right there, how fierce he is. He wants to punish Germany. Lloyd George here is a big dum-dum. That's not fair to Lloyd George. George Lloyd, rather. But he basically tells his voters at home, I want revenge. And then he tells everyone, but really what I want is peace. And so he basically is ineffectual, and France gets what they want because he doesn't stop them. The British are also bad about colonies and refuse to give up colonies. So the French and the British divide up colonies around the world. The Americans get some too, even though they complain about it. And basically, the Treaty of Versailles ends up vengeful and about punishing Germany because of kind of the old style power politics that were still going on in Europe. People didn't want to give up their empires. They didn't want to show any weakness because social Darwinism was still part of the thought process. And there was no motivation to be interested in the world's peace versus one country's immediate gain. So here are kind of some of the big provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations is probably the biggest. This is a foolish error on their part too. They exclude Germany and Russia from the League of Nations in the idea that these are belligerent powers. And this is Russia as the Soviet Union. Problem is, if you're not talking to your enemies, then how are they going to become friends? Territorial losses, Alsace-Lorraine goes back to France. That's not self-determination. Germany surrenders all its colonies. That's still imperialism by the European powers. The military restrictions on Germany are really important. They're prohibited from having more than 100,000 soldiers. They can't have major weapons manufacturers, or have an air force, or build Unterseeboats. The entire war gets placed on Germany, even though they were not the country responsible for the war. You could argue that's Serbia or Austria. So tiny type, but there's a lot of information here. Maps of Europe change. Basically, the colonies that were belonging to Germany were given to other countries. The Ottoman Empire here in the upper corner, divided up into modern Iraq, Syria, Jordan, will become Palestine, which becomes Israel. You've got, Kenya, Tanzania, my mistake, Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, Benin. So these are all modern countries that were basically given to away from Germany to these other nations. Austria-Hungary obviously breaks into pieces. The reason, and I'm going to go back to the first map. The reason all of these new countries or expanded countries, so Romania is a good example, and Poland, are so big is because France over here is looking for allies against Germany. And so if you've got, a bunch of big countries over here, you got big old France, you got Germany in the middle, squish. And so the hope for France, we want to prevent war in the future by making it so Germany is unable to make any moves against us whatsoever. So that's kind of the general idea. Just to kind of leave it off, major conflict, probably the most important conflict points in the future are the ones about Germany and heading A up here. And so, you're looking at a legacy of World War I. Well, it set up a potential for future conflict by giving away German land without self-determination. So their Germans' democratic rights are violated about, their nationalist ambitions, where Germans should live within a Germany according to nationalists. And that's kind of the beginning of the end for the Weimar Republic. So, set up for World War I, a German democracy is created, but kind of set up to fail. You've got, changes in the borders. You have a lot. You can look at a modern map of Europe if you want as an example. There's a lot of different ways to kind of describe the legacy of World War I. But in the end, it's ultimately, this is the shift between the modern world, which we live in now, obviously, and the world that came before. So before World War I, this was, was imperialism, social Darwinism, power politics. After World War I, there's at least the beginning of international cooperation and some sort of collective responsibility in world citizenry, frankly, that didn't exist prior to the First World War. Thanks for playing, kids. Let's stop this thing.